I'm going to ask the rest of us to turn to Genesis chapter 28. Genesis chapter 28. I want to thank Kenny for preaching last week and stealing the first point of my sermon today, so that's good. Last week we looked at chapter 27, and if you remember the story, if we go all the way back to Genesis chapter 12 and even all the way back to Genesis chapter 3, what we have is we're operating under this premise, the umbrella of God's covenant promises. God has made a promise that there will be one who will come from the seed of Eve who will redeem people out of their sin. So this sin story will turn into a redemption story, and we can look forward to that coming. And then in Genesis chapter 12, we see Abram being the one that's being called out of darkness, out of his moon worship, more than likely, into a relationship with the living God. And he is the one called out by God and chosen by God to carry forth this promise and this covenant. From Abraham's line will come the one who will be the Redeemer, the one we know as Jesus the Christ, the Messiah. Abraham, his only problem is he's old, and he has an old wife, and they don't have any kids. So that makes it really difficult to have a child and a line and become a great nation and to have a land and become one who blesses all the nations. But God provides, even though Abraham and Sarah run their own way and try to do God's job for him, God provides. And he provides a son, the second son born to Abraham, and this son's name is Isaac. Isaac trusts God most of the time, and yet also falls into this trap. He has a wife now who is barren, and they are praying God blesses, and God blesses them with two babies, twins in the womb. And those two twins are at war with one another from before they are born. So if you want to know if the Bible supports the idea that life begins at conception, just look at Jacob and Esau. And if you want to know whether people are depraved and dead in their trespasses and sins from birth, look at Jacob and Esau. Is everybody with me? So we have these grand principles that are being thrown out there, and God is moving in grace. And so God now says, hey, this is the way it's going to work. The second son, once again, will take the blessing. This is God's plan. It's not a second chance. It's not a plan B. This is God's ultimate plan. He's going to take the foolish things of the world and use them to confound the wise. He's going to take the world's ideas and he's going to flip them on their head, and he's going to take God's ideas and he's going to run with them. So Jacob will be the one who will get the blessing. Now, Isaac really likes Esau. And so if you remember last week we looked, and Isaac says, Esau, I want to give you the blessing, so here's what I want you to do. I want you to go out and I want you to hunt, and I want you to make me a meal, that stew that I really, really like. I want you to bring it back to me so I can eat it, so I can bless you. Now, Rebecca hears this and says, hey, Jacob, I'm going to take a goat and I'm going to make the stew that your dad really likes, and you're going to put on this fur and you're going to go in there and act like your brother, and what's going to happen is he's going to give you the blessing. Now, God's already promised that Jacob's going to get the blessing. You don't need to go fooling anybody and sinning, but because of their lack of faith, because of their lack of understanding that God is sovereign and he's going to work his purposes, even in the midst of our inadequacies, they want to take things into their own hand, and they do. And we come to this place now where Jacob has deceived his father and his brother. Esau wants Jacob dead. They got to get Jacob out of town. Jacob's going to leave. And now Jacob, in his sin, is going to find himself isolated from what seems to be the promises and the covenant of God. Have you ever sinned? Have you ever noticed that when you sin and when you habitually sin and when you find yourself caught in sin, that oftentimes you find yourself isolated from the people who love you the most? Welcome to Jacob's story. His mom helped him in this plot. She will never see him again. He's going to have to leave the land that God has promised to Abraham and Isaac, that he's supposed to be the one that's carrying the blessing. He's going to have to leave the land in exile. And we have this story that unfolds beginning in chapter 28 of Jacob going on this redemptive exile journey where God's going to move in power and show himself to be glorious and powerful at the beginning. And guess what? In about 4 chapters, you're going to see God show back up. And Jacob's going to have another moment with God. And I want you to see the beginning of this saga in Jacob's life, because I believe that many of us probably are at some point in Jacob's journey in our life, where we are dealing with sin in our life, where we often feel condemnation because of our sin, even though we know the Bible says there's therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. We know the Bible says it, but we have a hard time believing it, grasping it, and living it. And so we find ourselves in the darkness of our sin, the isolation, the exclusion of our sin, and we need a move of God's grace in our life in order to be reclaimed and refound. Look at Jacob's story here in chapter 28. It starts with Isaac calling Jacob and blessing him as he's sending him out. And he starts by saying, he directed him, "You must not take a wife from the Canaanite women." This sounds much like Abraham's feelings about Isaac, making sure there's no wife taken from the Canaanite women. Esau has already taken a couple of Canaanite women, and they are making life horrible, right, for his parents. "You must not take a wife from among the Canaanite women. Arise, go to Padan Aram, to the house of Bethuel, your mother's father, and take as your wife from there one of the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother." They know, Isaac knows, because Abraham's servant went to find him a wife in the same spot, right? So he knows there's godly people there. So go find the godly people. "God Almighty bless you and make you fruitful and multiply you, that you may become a company of peoples." He takes the blessing that's been given to him from Abraham to Isaac, and now he's passing it on to his son, this blessing of the covenant. "May he give the blessing of Abraham to you and to your offspring with you, that you may take possession of the land of your sojournings that God gave to Abraham." Thus Isaac sent Jacob away, and he went to Padan Aram to Laban, the son of Bethuel the Aramean, the brother of Rebekah, Jacob's and Esau's mother. Now Esau saw that Isaac, the scheming continues, right? So Esau sees, well, I got a blessing to Jacob now, right? And Isaac has blessed Jacob and sent him away to Padan Aram to take a wife from there. He knows, because you know that if your mom doesn't like your wife, you will find out about it, right? My mom loved my wife, by the way. But you will find out about it. And so he knows his parents don't like his current wives. So what does he hear? He hears, "You must not take a wife from the Canaanite women," and that Jacob had obeyed his father and his mother and gone to Padan Aram. So then when Esau saw that the Canaanite women did not please Isaac his father, Esau went to Ishmael and took as his wife, besides the wives he had, Mahalath, the daughter of Ishmael, Abraham's son, the sister of Nabaloth. Let me just make sure you understand this. This is how dense this man is, and blind in his sin, is he still thinks he has a chance at this blessing. This is how much he thought of the birthright and the blessing. He was willing to sell the birthright for a cup of stew, right? And the blessing, he thought, he didn't realize there's a spiritual reality to it. He's just looking for the physical fruit of the blessing. So he says, well, if Jacob gets another blessing, maybe I'll get in on Dad's good side if I marry somebody who's not a Canaanite woman. So what does he do? This is how dense he is. Let's go to that Ishmael guy, because my dad and him have always gotten along really, really well. You see what I'm saying? There's a denseness to when we are dead in our trespasses and sins. Like Ephesians 2 says it very clearly. You are dead in your trespasses and sins. There's a blindness that comes with that. And Esau is walking in that spiritual blindness. He does not understand the blessing of God. Jacob is a child of the promise, and he has a hard enough time understanding the blessing and the promises of God. The one who is dead in their trespasses and sins and blinds has no hope of understanding the promises of God. Look how bad it is for Jacob. Jacob himself is struggling. So Jacob left Beersheba and went toward Haran. And he came to a certain place and stayed there that night because the sun had set. So let's set the stage real quick. He's now had to leave the promised land. He's leaving. He's getting to the edge of the promised land, and he's going off into the outside of the promised land. So he's leaving what's promised. He's going outside of it, and darkness is setting in. This is meant to paint a picture for us that is not just physical darkness, but a spiritual darkness. In fact, in about 4 chapters, he's going to come back into the land, and God's going to show up again, and guess what they're going to do? They're going to spend their time together until the sun comes up. There's a storytelling feature going on here in the text. The sun's going down now, and he's entering into darkness, and when he comes back into the land, the sun's going to come up. And at each end of that story, the bookends of that story, God shows up. There's a beauty to that God's redemptive work is not just in the land. He's going to work among his people. And here we have the picture of it. So it's getting dark. Now he stops. So he takes one of the stones of the place. He put it under his head and lay down in that place to sleep. He was desperate. And he dreamed, and behold, there was a ladder set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven, and behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give to you and to your offspring. Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And in you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. He reiterates that Abram covenant and that Isaac covenant. Now it's Jacob's covenant. Behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. Sometimes you cannot make stuff up. That may be the most obvious statement ever uttered by a human being. And yet, he is surprised by it, isn't he? He thought he had left God behind when he left the tent city of his father. But God is with him. And he was afraid and said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. So early in the morning, Jacob took the stone that he had put under his head and set it up for a pillar and poured oil on the top of it. He called the name of that place Bethel. This will be an important place in the future. But the name of the city was Luz at the first. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, if God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. And this stone which I have set up for a pillar shall be God's house. And of all that you give me, I will give you a full tenth to you. Here in this moment, what we see is Jacob in his sin being met by a holy God full of grace and his response to that grace. This truly is the equation of salvation. This is the equation of what it looks like to be redeemed by God. If you are a believer in Jesus, you've experienced what Jacob experiences here. If you're not a believer in Jesus, this is going to be a foreign concept to you, and I want to unpack it for you so that you can see that there is nothing that you can or cannot do in order to earn favor with God. God demonstrates grace by his sovereign will and in his timing and in his way so that we will know him, be redeemed by him, and worship him. Jacob gets to experience this as a child of the promise. But look at the consequences of his sin. You can see it. It's dripping off the page. The first is isolation. He's on his own now. He's been sent off. He's no longer in the tent city. He's isolated from the experience of love and covenant community. His mom will never see him again. This mama's boy will never be around mama and her cooking anymore. I mean, there's a real heartache reality to this isolation that he's going through. You ever been in that place where you've sinned against someone and it's destroyed a relationship? Or they've sinned against you and it's destroyed a relationship? And you just wonder, is it ever going to go back to the way it was? It's an isolation that you feel. Oftentimes it can lead to depression. Oftentimes it leads to this real spiritual and emotional darkness. And here's Jacob in that place. He's excluded. And he believes he's under condemnation and excluded completely. Even though he has the blessing of his father, and his father says, look, I believe this about what God's going to do in you. He feels excluded from the benefits of the covenant promises of God. He's like, I'm leaving the land. I'm not going to get all the benefits of the land. And he is now feeling as an outsider. You started as a sojourner in the land. Now you're a sojourner away from the land. You don't even get the benefit of the land and the history of your people there. You ever feel excluded from what God's doing? You can see God moving in other people's lives, and it just doesn't seem to be happening in yours. What's our tendency when that happens? I know what my tendency is. Well, if I just try harder, right? If I can just get more spiritual, I can come up with a list of 10 spiritual truths, and if I try these 10, surely one of them is going to work. And if one of them works, then the blessing is going to start coming back. I'm going to start feeling the grace again, right? And so number 1 through 7 doesn't work. Number 8's too hard. Number 9, you saw somebody else try it once, so it's not worth trying. You get to number 10, this doesn't work. I must not be a Christian. It can just lead you down this road of despair. Well, the problem with all of that is very simple. We're looking at God more like he's a vending machine than anything else. I was driving back from Wake Forest, North Carolina yesterday, and I did something I hate doing. I stopped at a rest area. I'll tell you stories about that some other time. It's not appropriate here as to why I hate stopping at rest areas, but I stopped at a rest area, and I needed something to drink, and as I went to go get something to drink, by the way, I really love the fact that you no longer have to put money in the machines. You can swipe your card at a lot of these machines, because what's the problem? Like taking the dollar and trying to get it just perfect, right? So you can get it in. So I swiped my card, and I got a drink, and then I went to look, and there right next to the drinks, that vending machine. And they always have such healthy options in the vending machine. And it was just like, do I dare? Do I dare? And I did. I ate blueberry Pop-Tarts in the car on the drive home, and they were glorious. I'm not ashamed of it at all. But what did I do? I put my money in, or I swiped, and then I pressed the number. And then I pressed enter. And what do I expect to have happen? Pop-Tarts. Is everybody with me? That's not the way God works. But oftentimes we think that's how God's grace and his blessing comes down. I want to just go ahead and free every believer in here and every unbeliever in here up. I just want you to know, if you cannot do anything to earn God's blessing. Now, there are going to be a whole lot of guys who you can go turn on your cable TV, and they will tell you the exact opposite of that. But I want you to hear, if it's true that you could do anything to keep from having hardship in your life and only get blessing from God, Jesus didn't know the secret. Paul didn't know the secret. Peter didn't know the secret. It's not a single saint in the Old Testament who figured it out. None of the 12 disciples figured it out because they all died. There's nothing that you can do that will earn God's favor. It is grace upon grace upon grace from his sovereign hand. And so if you're feeling isolated, excluded, even in exile, even if you feel like you're just shut out, I want you to know this. There's no 12-step program to get back into the favors of God. Here's what you do. Grab a rock, lay down and go to sleep, and pray, God, have mercy on me. You know what he'll do? He'll have mercy on you if you're his child. If you're not his child and you say, Lord, have mercy on me, you know what he's going to do? All who call upon the name of the Lord will be saved. He'll have mercy on you. But if you keep trying to earn it and make it right and try to make up for everything, you'll never get it right. I want to release you from that today. That there is darkness and there is isolation and there is exclusion and there is exile that comes from our sin, but there is greater grace and greater mercy and greater love that comes through Jesus. Call out to him. So what does Jacob do? He lays down, puts his head on a rock. Now, I mean, I can sleep just about anywhere, but head on a rock does not sound comfortable to me. I just want to put this out there. Valentine's Day was this week, and my wife won in our house, so she won. I did come home, so maybe that was good, but she won. She got me a weighted blanket. Some of you are going, oh. Some of you are going, what? She won. It is the best. I came back from my trip. I went into my room. It was laying there on the bed. I unpacked it. I put it, and I pulled it over myself, and I was gone. The greatest thing ever? No, you cannot borrow it. But I like comfort. Anybody else like comfort? How many of you are one pillow people? Two pillow people? Three or more pillow people? This guy. Okay. Greatest thing about staying in a hotel is when I get a bed to myself and there are 4 pillows on that bed and 2 in the closet. Okay. Yeah, I love it. It's fantastic. Jacob sleeps on a rock. Evidently, he sleeps well because he gets into a dream. As he gets into this dream is not by any doing of Jacob. He's not conjuring this up. No, in the middle of his darkness, in the middle of his depravity, in the middle of his desperation, God shows up. God shows up and he shows him this vision in a dream of this staircase to heaven. And the angels are going up and down the staircase. It is a pure act of God's grace, undeserved and unsearched for. Jacob is not sitting there going, I really need God to show me something right now. God shows up on his own. That's real grace. Jacob didn't make a bargain with God and say, I'm going to lay down here, God. I need you to. No, God shows up on his own, undeserved, unsearched for. The Bible makes it clear there is none who seeks after God. It is pure grace that has God show up here. And what does God do? God shows him this picture, and the angels are going up and down, up and down, up and down this ladder. Don't get distracted by the angels. The angels are just agents of God's work. They are not the point of this. I want you to pay attention to the one who's above it. Look at what the text says. And behold, verse 13, and behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. The covenant God was standing at the top, directing traffic, making sure that his will and his purposes were being done. What's this picture meant to do? This picture is meant to reiterate the covenant that God had made. It was an ancient covenant given to his grandfather. It was an ancient covenant that goes all the way back to his great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. That there would be one who's coming, that God will be with his people, that he's going to redeem and he's going to work in the lives of his people. And now he gets a picture of God saying, I am your God. And these angels are doing God's bidding for the lives of his people. Here's Jacob in isolation and darkness, thinking he's outside of the blessing and the covenant of God. And God shows up and goes, no, where I am is where the covenant goes, and I am with you. And here are my angels who are doing my bidding for you. What good news. What glorious grace. That God's grace, undeserved and unsearched for, was working to reestablish and to enlighten Jacob to God's covenant. It was an ancient covenant, but it was now being newly experienced by Jacob. And what's the promise? The promise isn't just that I am your God. He says, your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, just like I told your forefathers. But I want you to look at verse 15 because this is the greatest promise. Behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go. And I will bring you back to this land that I've promised you. God's presence is a promise to Jacob that will take him all the way to Haran and all the way back. The power of God's presence will give him hope in the years that are coming of laboring for a wife, of being deceived as he's deceived others, of fear when he's coming back and his brother is he still out for blood? Of the sadness of losing a father and a mother and never seeing them again. The presence of the Lord will cause him to endure by his promise and his power. And then this overarching story. Behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go and will bring you back to this land. For I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. I want you to pay attention to a couple of words there. I will keep you and I've promised you. I will keep you and I will do this. This is God's economy at work. This is God mediating on behalf of his people. You realize God does that, right? That's what this picture is all about. God's up there saying, this is my will, this is who I am. All these angels are accomplishing everything I am going to do for my people. Now, don't get distracted by the angels, because they're not little cute, pudgy little, cherubs that you can put on top of wedding cakes or anything like that. What we're talking about here is we're talking about God's up there going, all right, Gabriel, go do this. Michael, go do this. These are the warring angels. These are the ones who are fighting the battles that we do not see. These are the ones who are glorious. They're the ones that if you were to see them, you would fall in fear. And they're doing the bidding of the Holy God. And they're doing it for you and for me. And I want to make sure you understand this. The picture we have here is they were operating under the sovereign will of God to accomplish God's purposes for a sinner. Not a guy who was living righteously, but a guy who was simply God's chosen one. He needed grace. And God was going to work grace. Isn't that good news? Does anybody else find that to be good news? Because I'm going to wake up tomorrow and I'm going to jack my life up again. Right? I'm going to do something and I'm going to need God's grace. And I'm going to feel like I'm on my own and it's not coming this time and maybe I've just overdone it and God's done with me now and he's going to go, no, look. I'm directing traffic and I'm taking care of you. I've promised you I will be with you and I'm mediating on your behalf. The consequences of sin, isolation, exclusion, exile, the revelation of God, this is what he needed. He needed God's grace. He needed God to show up in grace to remind him of the covenant. Remind us, Lord, not of our sin, but remind us of your righteousness. Remind us, O Lord, not how we fail, but how Jesus has paid it all. So when you find yourself, believer, when you find yourself in the depths of exile and isolation because of your sin, don't go, Lord, what do I have to do to make this right? Go, Lord, thank you that Jesus has made this right. Remind me over and over and over and over again that Jesus makes all things new, including me. Remind me of forgiveness and redemption. Remind me that I'm covered by his blood. Remind me that I'm hidden with Christ. That no one can snatch me from your hand, even me. I can't snatch myself from your hand. I can't leave because you won't let it happen. Remind me of your covenant promises, that your presence is with me always, and that you are mediating this covenant, all of the blessings that are coming through you. That's what we need. We need God to remind us of that. We need God to show up. So what should be our response? Well, we learned some things from Jacob here in response. The first thing is, you ever been surprised by God's grace? Because he's surprised. He sees this vision and he goes, what? I didn't expect God to be out here. He says, this is obviously a place where God is. Could it be that's true everywhere? And Jacob needed to learn that lesson. You know, God doesn't just show up, no, this is not your excuse not to come to church, but God does not just show up at Old Powhatan Baptist Church. Has he not shown up in the hardest times of your life? In the most isolated times of your life? Has he not shown up to give you grace and everything you need to endure? Right there in the middle of sadness, right there in the middle of not knowing what to do next. And you've been surprised, haven't you? I get surprised every time he does it. I'm like, oh yeah, that's right. He's really good at that. In fact, perfect at it. He was surprised. Oftentimes we're surprised by grace and by the presence of God. Don't lose that. Don't lose that childlike surprise when God shows grace again. Don't become entitled. Don't become like Paul says we shouldn't be. So should we sin more so that grace would abound more? May it never be. Oh, that we wouldn't become so entitled that we think we can get away with anything and God will show us grace. No, be surprised every time you fail. And may the failures each day be a little less heinous than the yesterday's failures. You with me? So may next year's failures be less heinous than this year's failures, and yet still keep the same surprise. God is gracious and good. The joy that comes with that surprise of reminding ourselves that God is here. And what comes next? Fear. It says, and he was afraid, verse 17. And he said, how awesome is this place? What was he afraid of? Well, let me make sure you understand this. He's a sinner. God is holy. And he says, how awesome is this place? God showed up to a sinner. So make sure we understand what's happening here. Sinfulness and holiness will clash. And it's not fun. It gets messy. It gets bloody. Jesus died when that happened. There is an awe and a fear that should come. Remember when Jesus died? When all of sinfulness and all of holiness clashed on the cross? What happened? The sky grew dark. People ran in fear. And when he died, you know what happened? The dead got up out of tombs and started walking around in the streets. It's fierce when God shows up. And it should cause fear because we are sinners in the presence of a holy God. But know this, yes, he is fearsome, but he is good. He is fearsome, but he is good. When we recognize sin and holiness are going to clash, it should cause us to give pause. First of all, whether we're going to indulge ourselves in the unholiness and the ungodliness, which we fall into so often, but also, can I come before God? Can I come before God in this state? And here's what he says. You can come before me in that state because I came to you in perfection in Jesus. Now, you can come before me with your sin, and I've given you Jesus to cover your sin. Oh, that we would remember this fearful reality of the cross that makes it possible for us to be in the presence of God. Next, what happens? Worship. Next morning, he takes the stone that he had put under his head and he set it up as a pillar, set up an altar and poured oil on the top of it as an act of worship. He called the name of that place Bethel, but the name of the city was Luz at the first. Then Jacob made a vow. And so he worships God in that moment. Your response, my response to God's gracious showing up in the midst of our sin and giving us everything we need for redemption should be worship. Hey, when we're singing, before the throne of God above, I have a strong and perfect plea, a great high priest whose name is love, whoever lives and pleads for me. My name is graven on his hands. My name is written on his heart. I know that while in heaven he stands, no tongue can bid me to depart. When Satan tempts me to despair and tells me of the guilt within, upward I look and see him there who made an end to all my sin. I mean, that should drive us to worship because we know that he's taken our sin upon him and he's given us redemption and grace. This is Jacob's reaction. He worships. Why do you worship? Sometimes I wonder in my own heart why I show up to worship, and sometimes I realize it's because if I don't, maybe God won't bless me this week. Oh, that we would never gather for that reason. Worship is always a response. Worship is always a response. So let's go back to the analogy of the vending machine. Okay, worship happened when I was eating the blueberry Pop-Tarts. Are you with? Not when I was putting the money into the vending machine. Are you with me on this? Like it was in response to how good the blueberry Pop-Tarts were. It wasn't putting the money in the machine to try to get the blueberry Pop-Tarts. But sometimes I think we get that in reverse. That it's possible we treat gathering together as a way to get something from God as opposed to a response of what God has given us. Jacob at least got that right. When God showed up, he responded. But was it perfect? Well, I mean, let's think about it. Now, God's shown up. He's given him this giant staircase. They wrote songs about it in the 70s. It's great. Everybody's with me on this, right? Okay. All right. So here's what happens. So everything's going to be perfect now, right? This is a guy who's had God show up and talk to him. And we have all of these stories already in the first 27 chapters of every time God shows up. These guys are changed utterly and they live perfect lives from that point on, right? No. What do we have? What we actually have is a very fledgling faith. A very fledgling faith. How do I know that? Look at what he says. This is his vow. First word. Anybody? If. Oh, come on. Anybody else pray that way? If God will, I will. If you will, I will. If you will, I will. If God, you'll do this, I'll do this. Anybody? This is the confession portion of the service right now. Okay? If I need to turn this way, anybody? Okay? All right. It's funny, your hands went up when I turned that way. So we're live streaming that, by the way. Okay. I want to make sure you understand this. Okay? What's going on in this moment is fledgling faith. But hear me on this. Fledgling, pitiful, struggling, small faith is not what we want to enter into heaven with, but it is enough to enter the kingdom. I'm going to say something really controversial to some of you. You ready? You are not saved by your faith. You are saved by His grace. Here's the good news. That's why Jesus could say things like faith as a mustard seed, faith as a child, imperfect, small, needing to grow. But His grace is sufficient. Oh, that we would be people who, when our faith is failing, we would rest on His grace. That we would keep coming back to His grace. That as our faith is failing, when our faith is struggling, when our faith is imperfect, when we know we're in need of being sanctified and made holy, of understanding more, of believing more, that we would keep coming back for more grace. Because He has grace to give. By grace you've been saved through faith. What's the next part? This is what? It's a gift. What's a gift? The faith and the grace. The whole process. So what if every time our faith is falling, we leaned on grace and we said, God, give me more faith. Give me greater faith. Give me deeper faith. Give me more mature faith. Every time that we fail in faith, we would come back and say, God, I need your grace because I need more faith. I don't need just my behavior changed. I need to believe you more. I need to trust you more. I need more faith. Oh, that we would be people who would seek what God gives, and that's faith by His grace. Jacob's faith isn't perfect here. Jacob's faith is full of ifs and thens. But it's a faith that demonstrates he's part of the kingdom because God is demonstrating His greater grace. So, the consequences of your sin, God shows up in His grace, showing you what He's done, what He's accomplished, what He will do, and you believe Him. You believe Him, you trust Him, and it leads you in response to worship Him. You might be afraid of Him at first, and you might still live in fear of Him because you know He's holy, but you worship Him in response. This is the equation of salvation. You were dead in your trespasses and sins, but God. But God. And then we respond to His glorious grace and faith. So where does this leave us? Well, if you're a believer, what it should leave you with is it should leave you with pursuing Jesus with everything you have, because He's the ultimate fulfillment of God's grace. He's the ultimate fulfillment of God's gracious presence. Jesus is the true stairway to heaven. He said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. He's the only one who gets us to the Father. Those angels can't do anything for you when it comes to your salvation, but Jesus is the way. Jesus is the true mediator between God and man. There is only one mediator, the man Jesus Christ. He's the only one who is worthy to mediate between us as humanity and God as Father. He's the only one, and He sits at the right hand of the Father interceding for us day and night. He's the Holy One who entered into the Holy of Holies, this throne room of God, and sat down at the right hand of the Father to demonstrate His holiness, that there is no sacrifice necessary anymore because He paid the price for our sins. And now He intercedes on our behalf. He is the true mediator between God and man. And Jesus Himself is the fulfillment of God's grace and presence. Revelation chapter 21 tells us, it shows us a picture of what's going to happen when all of the veil is torn back and the new heavens and the new earth comes, and there's no need for a stairway anymore between heaven and earth. There's no need for the angels to be coming back and forth because earth and heaven are one in this new heaven and new earth. And I want to make sure you understand this. There's no need for a sun anymore because Jesus is lighting up all of heaven by his very holy presence. And this is the beauty of what we see in Revelation chapter 21. I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Behold," same word, "behold." He said it a couple of times when he was talking to Jacob here. He says, "Behold," so pay attention to this. "The dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away." The dwelling place of God is with man. Jesus fulfills the promise given to Jacob, "I will be with you." And that's ours for eternity as children of God. But I want to make sure you understand this. If you have not trusted Jesus and his grace, you are left in the darkness. The sun sets. You lay your head down in the darkness and you wake up in the darkness. There is no light. You have had set before you today a picture that God has worked out all of the intercession in his economy for what it looks like to come to him in the person of Jesus Christ. One mediator, Jesus. And you can be in the darkness or you can be in the light of his presence. It's the only two places you hang out, one or the other. He has already demonstrated great grace to you by letting you hear of his great grace. My call to you is be reconciled to God. Trust him. Come out of the darkness into the light. Trust him that he might bring you into new life. Let's pray.